Welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
where we discuss all things Bible and theology.
Because it matters. What you really believe determines how you really behave.
Now, here is your host, Associate Professor of Bible Exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary
and Professor of Bible and Theology for the National Theological College and Graduate School,
Dr. Paul Weaver.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, whatever time it is when you're watching or listening to this podcast. I'm your host, Paul Weaver, and on this program, it's my great privilege to lead discussions about all things Bible and theology with some of my favorite Bible scholars and expositors. And I'm pleased this week to have on the program Dr. Michael Gleghorn. Dr. Gleghorn is a professor at Grand Canyon University, where he is an instructor of a course there called Christian Worldview. Prior to that, he was a research associate at Probe Ministries for many years. Dr. Gleghorn earned his Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from Baylor University. He earned a Master of Theology from Dallas Theological Seminary and his Doctor of Philosophy in Theological Studies also from Dallas Theological Seminary. Dr. Gleghorn and I go back many years. He's a friend and an adjunct professor of the Word of Life Global Bible Institute, specifically many years in the country of Hungary, where our friendship began many years ago. Dr. Gleghorn, welcome back to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast.
Thank you so much, Paul. It is great to be here with you today.
Well, I'm excited to discuss the subject matter of this podcast. We're going to discuss ancient evidence for Jesus from non-biblical sources. So although we certainly believe in the inspiration and inerrancy of Scripture, and we of course learn a lot about Jesus from it, and that's our primary source of information, but there's a lot of evidence from antiquity outside of the Bible. Would you please explain, Dr. Gleghorn?
There are many historians, both Greek and Roman, as well as Jewish sources from the 1st and 2nd century that we'll consider today that mention Jesus and early Christianity. And so these sources then become an important part of the discussion because these are non-biblical and explicitly non-Christian sources. They come from both pagan and Jewish authors. And so these are not people that have any sort of intention of promoting the Christian faith. They're just simply writing in their capacity as historians.
Yes, and so these are early ones too, correct?
Yeah, the ones we'll talk about today are all within the 1st and 2nd centuries.
In our program today and next week, we're going to be looking at sources that we might call hostile sources or hostile witnesses. Would you explain?
Some are certainly hostile, yes. Like we'll talk about the Babylonian Talmud later, and we'll see that that's hostile. Pliny the Younger is a relatively hostile witness. Josephus would be probably more neutral, and there's a lot to say about Josephus and what he has to say about Jesus and the early Christians, but none of them are really positive on Christianity. They're either neutral or positively hostile.
So these sources that we're looking at today in this episode and in our next episode are clearly not seeking to promote or advance Christianity in any way, but in their recording of historical details and events, they do include details that are affirmed in the Gospels surrounding the life, death, burial, and even implications upon the resurrection and growth of the early church.
Yeah, that's what I think is really important, is that these sources, although it's only in a kind of a skeletal outline form, but in that outline form, they do affirm and go to confirm a lot of the things about Jesus and early Christians that we can read about in the New Testament. So in that sense, they act as a confirmation, so to speak, on what we learn about Jesus and early Christianity from the biblical sources.
It's worth repeating again, we do believe that the Bible is inspired. That means it's God-breathed, it's from God, and it's without error in the original manuscripts. That's inerrancy. We believe in the historical reliability of Scripture and the truthfulness of the details recorded in it. But these extra-biblical sources do provide additional affirmation to the things we already believe and know to be true. Well, Dr. Gleghorn, this is a very interesting topic, one that I would say there's only a limited amount of scholars who are well-versed in these sources. So would you share a little bit about the background as to why you began studying this topic?
Yeah, I originally wrote this article when I was full-time with Probe Ministries, and part of the reason that I became interested in this subject and writing the article for their radio program and website was because we would receive questions from both Christian and non-Christian who would email us questions, and some of those questions had to do with whether Jesus was an actual historical person. Did Jesus of Nazareth really exist in space and time and history in the first century, or are these just stories that we read about Jesus in the Bible that are fictional and that there was no actual historical person named Jesus of Nazareth? And so really in trying to respond to these questions that we would receive there at Probe about Jesus got me interested in looking into this issue further.
Well, I'd invite you, our listeners and viewers, to head over to probe.org, and there you can find Dr. Gleghorn's article. It's entitled Ancient Evidence for Jesus from Non-Christian Sources. And Probe Ministries is a great ministry that Dr. Gleghorn has been a part of for years and still is in a part-time capacity. And they have a lot of great resources in the area of apologetics and worldviews. Well, let's begin discussing some of this ancient evidence for Jesus of Nazareth from non-Christian sources. And I'd love to start with a Roman historian by the name of Tacitus. In your article, Dr. Gleghorn, you quote a well-known scholar, one whose books I've read, Edwin Yamauchi. He calls one of the writings of Tacitus, and now I'm quoting, the most important reference to Jesus outside of the New Testament. First, please tell us a little bit about Tacitus, and then about the writing that Dr. Yamauchi is referencing.
Yeah, Tacitus is, as you mentioned, a Roman historian. His dates are roughly around 55 AD to 117 to 120 AD. So from the middle of the first century to the early part of the second century. And the passage that we'll be looking at comes from a work that he wrote called the Annals, which was published in 115 AD, so in the early part of the second century.
And for those who are listening on your favorite podcast platform, you might want to head over to our YouTube channel. Simply go to youtube.com and search for Bible and Theology Matters in their search engine. I'm going to insert the quotations on the video that I'm reading in this episode. So let me read this statement by Tacitus and then have Dr. Gleghorn. I would love to hear your comments on it. Nero fastened the guilt as culprits and punished with the utmost refinement of cruelty a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate. Dr. Gleghorn, would you begin explaining the significance of this quote?
The first thing to point out, just for the sake of our audience, is that what Tacitus is addressing here is the fire, the great fire that occurred in Rome in 64 AD, and that many people thought may have been set by Nero himself in order that he might rebuild the city according to his own likings. In order to try to remove any sort of guilt from himself, he foisted this upon the Christians, and that's really what Tacitus is talking about. And you'll notice there are several interesting things that he says in this passage. He mentions how the Christians received their name from one Christus, and this is a reference to Christ. He seems to think that this is his name. Christus was the name. But of course, as we know, Christus is a title, meaning Christ, the Messiah, or the Anointed One. But he does understand that the Christians derived their name from this person who had the title Christus or Christ. And he goes on to tell us that he was executed by crucifixion. He says that he suffered the extreme penalty, which refers to the Roman method of execution that we know as crucifixion, and that this occurred under the reign of Emperor Tiberius, who ruled from AD 14 to 37, and under the procuratorship of Pontius Pilate, who was procurator from 26 to 36 AD. And so he gives us a lot of historical information. He places this very precisely within the time period of Emperor Tiberius and the procuratorship of Pontius Pilate. And he tells us that this person, Christus, was crucified. And so he gives us a lot of information that dovetails quite nicely with what we learn about Jesus, particularly the death of Jesus, from the New Testament itself.
It is interesting that Tacitus calls Christianity a pernicious superstition.
Yes, and that's one of the things that's interesting about this is the way that this short passage concludes. And so if I read this section, he says that Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And then he says this, a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. This is one of those things that's speculative because Tacitus doesn't explicitly tell us what he's referring to here. But some have thought, for instance, J.N.D. Anderson, in a book that he wrote, suggests that it could be that Tacitus is here bearing implicit or indirect witness to the Christian belief in the resurrection of Jesus. Because he mentions that this mischievous superstition, which was checked with the death of Jesus, so all the people that, may have come to believe that Jesus was the Messiah, and then he's publicly executed. And that might have raised a question in their minds. Even though Jesus predicted his death and subsequent resurrection in the Gospels, the disciples really seem to have latched onto the fact that he would be killed, don't seem to have necessarily understood him literally when he was talking about the resurrection, that this would happen immediately. So with the death of Jesus, you seem to have a situation which might have called that into question. Was Jesus actually the Messiah after all, or have we been following a false Messiah? But then with the resurrection of Jesus 3 days later, that would have reaffirmed that their belief in Jesus as the Messiah was really true. And so this mischievous superstition that was checked for the moment with the death of Jesus again breaks out, not only in Judea, Tacitus tells us, the first source of the evil, but even makes its way to Rome. Like I say, although this is speculative because Tacitus doesn't explicitly tell us this, it could be that this is bearing indirect witness or indirect testimony to the Christian belief in the resurrection of Jesus.
So this quote includes a few important details, doesn't it? We have the title Christus, which is, of course, as you said, a title, not a name. It means anointed one. So we have the title of Christus, we have the name of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, and we have the name of Pontius Pilate, who is identified as the governor of Judea. All these details found in the gospel accounts as well. By the way, Tacitus gets the title of Pontius Pilate wrong, doesn't he? He calls Tacitus a procurator, but we learn that the correct title is prefect. That is the title on the first century stone discovered in Caesarea Maritima with the name Pontius Pilatus, prefect of Judea. Luke, however, does not make the same mistake that Tacitus did, which just reinforces the fact that Tacitus is one who can make errors, whereas Luke, under the direction of the Holy Spirit, is without error. How about this statement by Tacitus, where in Rome everything finds its vogue?
It is an interesting statement. I mean, it's, from his perspective, it's like this is a corrupt society. And even though he doesn't really have anything nice to say about the Christians, although it is interesting as the passage continues, he does talk about how people began to recognize or began to suspect that Nero was trying to deflect the blame from himself to the Christians, and people actually began to have compassion on these people that were being cruelly executed for what they thought, as Tacitus said, was simply to glut one man's cruelty, rather than for any reasons that were just.
So in a way, Tacitus is being helpful to the Christian cause by defending them in a sense, although he thinks it's pernicious.
Yes, it is one of those things where he talks about, he says Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations. The Christians are hated for their abominations, and yet when they're cruelly executed like this, as Tacitus says, seemingly to glut one man's cruelty rather than for reasons that were just and fair, people began to have some second thoughts possibly and feel compassion for the Christians, that they're not being put to death for reasons of justice, but just cruelty.
Again, Tacitus is not a Christian, and he's not seeking to defend the Gospels in any way. He's simply stating the facts, but it dovetails nicely with what the Bible says.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that scholars that I've read suggest that Tacitus very well had information from like the Roman archives and so forth, that he could have had access to firsthand documents related to the trial and execution of Jesus, and not getting this information from the Gospels, but is getting it from other sources.
In just a moment, we will return to our conversation about leadership. But first, let me share with you our Missions Minute of the week. Today we'll be hearing from Rachel in the country of Lebanon, who is a graduate of the National Theological College and Graduate School, also known as NTCGS.
Hello everyone, I'm Rachel. I'm from Lebanon. I have started to study theology at NTCGS 4 years ago. I started with very little biblical knowledge, but after 4 years of study, NTCGS has gave me a clear and biblical understanding of the Christian doctrines. Now I have a solid biblical foundation and ready to defend my faith in Jesus and talk about the reason of my hope. Now in my ministry, I'm leading many groups of Bible study. They are ladies from Muslim background, also Christian ladies coming from ritual churches, and I give them Bible study lessons. I also give counseling sessions for women who are suffering, who are facing many problems in their family or in the society, in their surroundings. I encourage you to support NTCGS because they are doing a great job in glorifying God and in giving students a solid knowledge about Jesus and about the scripture.
The National Theological College and Graduate School is a strategically placed school with 3 campuses in the Middle East and 1 in East Africa. To learn more about how you can partner with NTCGS in equipping future leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ, like Rachel, in Lebanon, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and East Africa, please visit ntcgs.org. That's ntcgs.org. Now, let's return to our previously recorded conversation.
Very good. Well, let's talk about another ancient source, extra-biblical, non-canonical source. We want to discuss Pliny the Younger. Please tell us who Pliny the Younger is and Pliny the Elder. These are 2 different figures in history, aren't they?
Yes, Pliny the Younger was actually the nephew and adopted son of Pliny the Elder, and Pliny the Younger became the Roman governor of Bithynia in the early 2nd century, and Pliny the Elder, who was his uncle and adopted father, actually is well known as a natural scientist of sorts, and perished in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius when he wanted to be there to witness the eruption firsthand, and actually ended up perishing in that volcanic eruption. His nephew and adopted son, Pliny the Younger, became the Roman governor of Bithynia in Asia Minor. He mentions the Christians in a letter written to Emperor Trajan around 112 AD, 111 or 112 AD. He's very well known for all the letters he wrote. He was a very good letter writer, and his letters have been preserved. And in a letter to Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century, he actually mentions the Christians, and that's where this next quotation comes from.
All right, let me read the writings of Pliny the Younger and then have you comment on it. They were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day, before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath not to any wicked deeds, but never to commend any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust, when they should be called upon to deliver it up, after which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind.
Yes, and so here we have Pliny in a letter to Emperor Trajan mentioning the Christians, and the context is that Pliny is not really sure what to do with these Christians. He is writing to Emperor Trajan because he's not really sure, how am I supposed to handle these people? And he points out to Emperor Trajan that lots of people are becoming Christians from all ages, from all levels, society, the rich, the poor, slave and free, all kinds of people are becoming Christians, and that this is becoming a problem because the Christians will not worship the emperor. They will not worship the gods of the Roman Empire. Their allegiance is solely to Jesus. And Pliny has had some of them actually put to death because he thought that they were just being insubordinate and inflexible by their utter refusal to get on board with the way that Romans typically do things these days. But he begins to question whether this is the best approach because there are so many Christians in the society at that time. And a number of the things that he mentions here in this brief letter, he mentions, first of all, that the Christians would meet on a certain fixed day before it is light. And this seems to refer to the early Christian habit of meeting on Sunday mornings in order to publicly worship the Lord together as a body. He mentions, in addition, how they would sing hymns to Christ as to a God. And what's really interesting about this, I read one scholar who was talking about the fact that Pliny seems to recognize that the early Christians are worshiping a person as God who was an actual historical individual that was crucified under Pontius Pilate. And so you have this interesting testimony to the fact that the early Christians were worshiping an actual historical person as God, which goes to emphasize the fact that the early Christians believed in both the humanity and deity of Christ. So that's a very interesting point that Pliny makes here in this brief paragraph.
I've been in conversations with unbelievers who say Jesus never claimed to be God. And of course, in my classes on the Gospels, I show that this is just manifestly false. We have Jesus' own statements equating himself with God when he says, I and my Father are one. Another example is when he calls himself the Son of Man, and Caiaphas tears his garments and says it's blasphemous. Jesus forgives sin, so it seems clear in the four Gospels that Jesus claimed to be God. He was performing miracles as God, forgiving sin as God, but it's neat to see in this early extra-biblical source that they also recognize that he's being worshipped as God by the early church.
Yeah, Pliny views this as just this crazy superstition of these early Christians, but it is fascinating that in the early 2nd century, through torturing some of these people and trying to pry information from them, that one of the things that he mentions to Emperor Trajan is that the Christians are worshiping this actual historical person as a god. And so, yeah, I think that that's very, very fascinating.
Also, as you mentioned, Pliny references the spread of Christianity. That certainly affirms what we read in the book of Acts, doesn't it? As we see the gospel starting in Jerusalem, but not staying in Jerusalem, it spreads to the ends of the earth. So that's very interesting as well, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, I mean, Pliny, one of the things that he mentions, as I said earlier, in the opening part of his letter to Emperor Trajan, is that he's just becoming unsure what to do with these people because they're coming from all segments of society, rich and poor, young and old, male and female, slave and free. I mean, all kinds of people are converting to Christianity, and it's becoming a problem in his view as, what do we do with these people? Final thing that I was going to mention is this interesting comment that Pliny also makes. You mentioned it in your original reading from Pliny, that they mentioned that they would come back later and partake of food together, but food of an innocent and ordinary kind. Many have speculated, or at least some have speculated, that Pliny seems to be bearing witness to here is the Christian celebration of the Lord's Supper, and that the Christians were concerned to make clear to Pliny that all they were doing is, when they would observe the Lord's Supper, is they were partaking of food of an ordinary and innocent kind, because of the nature of the Lord's Supper, Jesus identifying the bread as his body and the wine as his blood. You had some people suggest that the Christians were actually practicing some form of ritual cannibalism or ritual murder and then eating the body and drinking the blood of these slain victims. And we see here that the early Christians are concerned to refute that and say that, we're observing the Lord's Supper. This is food of an ordinary and innocent kind. It's just simply bread and wine. It's nothing that has to do with actual human flesh or blood, but is symbolic of the body and blood of the Lord.
So it appears at this time that Judaism is being tolerated. Judaism is being allowed to operate, but now we have this new thing, the followers of Jesus of Nazareth. And that's what Pliny's trying to figure out. He seems convinced that stamping them out is not going to work.
His primary concern, it seems, is that there's just too many of them now, And so he's wanting to go to Emperor Trajan and find out, what is Rome's official policy here? What should I be doing? And Emperor Trajan actually, in his letter in response, basically tells him, don't pursue the Christians, don't try to round them up. If somebody is reported, they have to have their own name on the report. It's like, we're not going to accept anonymous reports against the Christians. And the way Emperor Trajan responds is, in a sense, we live in a more enlightened age now, and let's not be trying to round people up on rumors and hearsay. If people are brought before you and there are actual witnesses and actual crimes have been committed and so forth, that's one thing, obviously. But let's not be accepting things on rumors, and let's not be just going after the Christians just because they're Christians. There has to be more to it than that.
Yeah, and by now there's emperor worship, and followers of Jesus are not willing to worship the emperor or any false god for that matter.
That's one of the things that Pliny mentions to Emperor Trajan. He said that, some of these people said, for instance, that maybe they were Christians in the past, but they no longer are, or that they've never been Christians. And so what Pliny would have them do, at least in some cases, would be to curse Christ and then burn incense to the emperor. And he tells Emperor Trajan, he's like, true Christians will not do that. They will die before they do something like that. And so that this is an effective way to separate the true believers from the unbelievers. So he recognizes that this seems to be an effective way of distinguishing the two. But of course, if I'm going to then go ahead and put these people to death, I'm going to be putting to death a whole lot of people. Emperor Trajan is like, let's not do that. That's not consistent with our current enlightened age. And I think he recognizes that that's going to create a lot more problems than we want or need. And it's unnecessary. If these people aren't doing anything evil or causing real problems, then let's not do that.
Very interesting. A lot of helpful details from these extra biblical sources. Our time is up, though, for today's episode, but we're certainly not finished discussing this interesting subject of the ancient evidence for Jesus from non-Christian sources. In next week's episode, we will continue our conversation on this subject. We will discuss the writings of Josephus Flavius, a first-century historian. We'll see what he has to say about Jesus of Nazareth. We'll also see what the Babylonian Talmud, an ancient Jewish source, has to say about Jesus. Finally, we will investigate the writings of Lucian, so you won't want to miss that program. So make sure to join us again for our next episode. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please consider liking it, subscribing to it, and sharing it with others. This will help our program become more accessible to those who are interested in faith-affirming programming. That's it for today, but until next time, never forget, Bible and theology matters, because what you really believe determines how you really behave.
Bible and Theology Matters podcast is a listener-supported podcast
devoted to helping Christians grow in their knowledge of the Word of God and in their relationship to the God of the Word.
To learn how you can partner with the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
visit us at BibleandTheologyMatters.com. That's Bible, A-N-D, TheologyMatters.com.